Today's lectionary text asks the same question. How might we practice God's commandments with courage and with respect for one another, putting aside our own fears? I cannot imagine a more appropriate set of text for our time. During these days of quarantine, we've seen our differences replaced with kindness and deference toward one another. We have discovered value in those who only a few months ago might have been invisible. We have seen ourselves living the great commandment to love God and love our neighbor. And we're doing that, and we've done that by staying home. Now, as we're beginning to see what opening up might look like, old tensions have flared up, and there is a familiar unease. Today's lesson from Acts gives us a glimpse of the way that Paul approached the cultural differences he found during his time in Athens. It gives us some clues about a way forward. The backstory is this. Paul came to Athens after being asked to leave Thessalonica, where he had had some success building a church. His intent in coming to Athens was to let things cool off in Thessalonica. But because Paul is Paul, he could not help himself and began teaching about Jesus in a way that caused some attention. The philosophers who heard him accused him of being a babbler of old ideas and a seed picker who trafficked in a strange religion. And so they called him to the high court to explain himself. The people in the audience were philosophers and poets and intellectuals, all interested in hearing the new babbler. Remember, Athens was not a monotheistic culture, and Paul had seen the many temples used for worship of deities, and so he began with an affirmation. I see that you are very religious. He started by simply naming common ground. He then went on to find another connection through Greek poets and asked them to imagine one God who is the maker of all things, that gives life and breath and everything else. In him we live and move and have our being. Paul acknowledged the universal truth that humans seek a God who is always near. And it was only at the end of his speech that he mentions the resurrection of Jesus, who is referred to as a man appointed by God. What began as a philosophical affirmation ends with a call to an alternative ethic that requires a change in the way we see God and the way we see each other. In the end, Paul's mission in Athens did not produce great numbers of converts, but those who did would lay the foundation for a church that ultimately affected millions of people, and Athens would become an important center for Christianity. And it started with what Paul no doubt saw as a failed mission. Perhaps it is time for us to pursue an alternative approach to each other. It seems that part of our time in quarantine has been a cultural failure. We're beginning to lose that gentleness that was shared so generously in the beginning, the tender recognition that all lives matter and that our nurture of each other is important, and yes, we are dependent on one another. It is true that we have learned things we didn't know before, how to pray together publicly in a whole new way. We found new ways to stay in touch and to learn together and to care for one another. Those things will remain and even sustain us in the long days ahead. Still, the culture wars have reemerged. Some are afraid of the reopening and fear the risk to their health and the health of their family. Others see the pandemic as a hoax. Still others want only to return to their pre-pandemic life. Those of us who rely on science and those of us who interpret it differently have taken on a similar persona of smugness. And that seems almost impossible to penetrate. Retired Bishop Jake Owensby has a sober observation. Our contempt for each other is killing us as individuals and as a nation. It's time we take what Barbara Brown Taylor calls gospel medicine, the love that heals us. It seems that healing medicine is slipping through our fingers every day the culture wars continue. So how do we move forward? How do we move from here? I had an experience of that last January when I was invited to participate in a Martin Luther King celebration. It included a discussion of one of MLK's little-known speeches. And I knew that the participants would represent a broad range of Christian perspectives. I knew that I would be a minority and that some participants might not have ever met a female clergy. I was nervous. What I didn't expect was an overwhelming longing to connect, to learn about each other's point of view. We found common ground in that speech. We listened. We looked each other in the eye. We spoke the truth we knew, and we saw that we were more alike than not. But were minds changed that day? Most likely not. But we shared the start of a relationship. That smugness was nowhere to be seen, and there was only respect. And that was one morning, but it was a reminder of what can be if we give ourselves an opportunity to be with those we don't know or might be uncomfortable with. If we do it with purpose, again and again and again, fractures will heal. And that is the gospel medicine Paul understood in Athens, that ever-expanding goodness of love seen in the life of Jesus. Bishop Owensby offers some concrete steps we can take to end what he describes as the epidemic of contempt. From Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself, seek the common good. Love your enemy, respect differing opinions as arising from a sincere desire to find the common good. Forgive each other, seek reconciliation, and admit that you're not always right and that other people have a perspective you need to hear. These are not easy steps. They will take work and desire. But it's what we're called to do in order to reclaim that world we experienced for a short, sweet time when we saw each other with our hearts instead of our minds. It means re-entering the world and living it with open minds and hearts towards those we disagree with. It will take time and a commitment to the idea that healing this great, vast, diverse land is important. And it's important not just for us, but for all those who will follow us. We know the way. We know it is the way of love. Amen.